And thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Kettering. I'm the host for today's podcast. And what we're doing today is I'm helping to facilitate a conversation. And this is a conversation with Matt Partlow. The topic is multiple myeloma and the horrible form of cancer that strikes over 500,000 people every year. And our point today is to talk with Matt about his experience, what he went through at multiple different levels, and about CAR T cell therapy, the miraculous experimental therapy that is helping many people, even though it's still in experimental trial form. And Matt was one of those people. So today we want to have a hopefully informative and hopefully inspirational conversation about this disease, some of the issues around going through that experience, and ultimately about how Matt found his way to CAR T cell therapy, to the clinical trial, and how it created a positive outcome for him. So without further delay, let me introduce Matt Partlow. Matt, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So, Matt, I just want to thank you for making yourself available and opening yourself up to this kind of a conversation. A lot of people don't really want to share this kind of information. And as you've told me, there really is a lack of information about multiple myeloma and the therapies for it, and especially this CAR T cell trial opportunity. And so hopefully by listening, our viewers will be able to learn a lot about what you went through and how maybe they or someone that they love can take advantage of what you've already learned.
Yeah, I think to clarify, there is quite a bit of information about multiple myeloma itself. Mm-hmm. What I think is missing is that you won't find patients who can talk about it or have talked about it. You'll find doctors that have done videos talking about multiple myeloma and trials of different types. But I wanted to share a firsthand experience. But I want to put that in context so that people understand that my situation might be very different from theirs. As an example, if someone in the future is diagnosed with multiple myeloma, they would probably do CAR T while they're still pretty healthy. I was very sick.
Right.
I was literally in my expected month that they predicted I'd be out of time. And so I think a couple things. I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma in 2015. Almost exactly 3 years later, I had gone through every single FDA-approved treatment for multiple myeloma that there was. Now, some people will start out on a chemotherapy like Revlimid with dexamethasone, which is a steroid, and they might stay on that for quite some time. For me, that, as an example, worked for about 10 months. And it was not that bad as far as the chemo part. The steroid part I struggled with because you're taking a massive dose. But in that time frame where we ran out of FDA-approved medicine, my oncologist sat my wife and I down and said, we're really in trouble. We're going to have to look for a trial on chemo, or maybe even look into compassionate use or right to try, which is you need to have the approval of the pharmaceutical for that, and 2 doctors have to approve. It really kind of comes down to, look, this guy's in trouble anyway and is willing to give something a try.
So you had gone through, at this point, 3 years of traditional therapies, right?
Correct.
Radiation, chemotherapy. Had you tried stem cell?
Yes, I did that. That lasted that worked for 6 months. And that's another thing. For some people, stem cell has worked for 5, 6 years. They scored me based on my age and my organs and my general health. And they try to come up with an estimate that, a person in your condition, your age, as I said, we think that if it's successful, meaning your stem cells engraft themselves to your bone marrow, which may not happen, by the way, which is you're really in trouble. So for me, after 11 days, those stem cells did engraft to my bone marrow, which is a relief, every big sigh of relief. Your immune system is compromised, and then you're let out. And so the problem is you can't tell whether it's really working for 3 months. Any kind of testing would give you a false positive. And so we waited from September of 2016 until January of 2017. And I got a call from a nurse coordinator saying, "Hey, congratulations, everything just looks great," And so suddenly I was high stepping on my walks around the block, right? And it was a big relief. And then I was driving in the car, phone rang. I answered it on the car speakers. It was my oncologist in March of 2017 saying, "Hey, the myeloma's back." But in that time frame, we still hadn't run out of FDA-approved treatments for myeloma. So we went back onto something called Pomalyst and steroids again. It's funny with steroids real quick. Every time I ever took a prescription to a pharmacy, other than the SCCA pharmacy,
right,
the pharmacist would look at it and go, "Well, these come in 4-milligram pills, but your doctor put down 40, and I think that's a mistake." And it's like, "No, I have multiple myeloma." And they'd go, "Oh, well, let me tell you something. 1 4-milligram dexamethasone is like rocket fuel." And I'm a high metabolism guy, as you know. And so for me, 40 milligrams of dexamethasone, I was awake for 36 hours.
Wow.
And it just wired to the 9. So that was extremely difficult. So anyway, we got to the point in 2018 where, my doctor often soft pedals death, if you will. And so the code word or the dog whistle is, "We're in trouble." And really, that was the first time I said to him, I feel like I, for the first time, need to ask you, well, how long do I have to live? Something that never even crossed my mind. I had heard of CAR T. We were trying to bridge to CAR T. That's the whole idea, is keep this thing in check until something comes along that's really going to be effective.
In the hopes that it would get far enough down the path that you'd be eligible for it.
Right. So his answer was, "Well, just so you know, I'm guessing. I really don't know. But based on my, years of experience, I would say something like 12 to 18 months, unless we find a trial that works or we get you into a CAR T study." However, the irony was that you have to be perfectly sick, if you will, for a study. And I was too healthy to get into studies in that time frame. So we did get into a chemo trial. And in fact, I have notes. The doctor literally wrote down, "Hey, here's our choices." And none of them are good, by the way. It's like, well, let's see, there's 5 choices and they're all horrible. But I like bendamustine and pomalidomide, which he was right. It was horrible. but it worked until November of 2018. And then we found another trial and we got on that. And after 3 months, it just wasn't working. And I was actually okay in the January 2019 timeframe. I was riding my bike. You may recall we had what people here called Snowmageddon. And suddenly I wasn't riding my bike. And so what I decided to do was, this was a vintage bicycle. It was really cool. It was like finding a Cadillac in a barn. And this bike was built in Amsterdam, and friends of ours who are now in their 80s gave us a his and her set of these bikes. So I took it apart completely down to the very last, nut, bolt, spring, and refurbished it. And I'm only saying all of this to give you a sense for how well I was doing. I was in pain. I was a little bit sick, but by then I had pretty much mastered the cure for the side effects, right? There's things called compazine and Zofran and Ativan and that type of thing. And after a while, you get pretty good about preemptively controlling nausea, which is always a huge problem for chemotherapy. But in a short period of time, at the end of March, I stood up out of a chair and broke my leg.
That's when that started. That was in 2018?
19.
19, okay.
Yeah, just over a year ago.
So the
now.
bones started to give out at that point.
I was dinging around the house. I was working on putting a new connector on the end of the cable. And I was sitting in an office chair that I had that had wheels. So I rolled up and, fixed the cable connector and stood up, put my weight on my left leg to do a 180 and get out of the guest bedroom, actually. And I heard this sound. It sounded like someone was cracking a walnut. And it was sort of like slow motion. And in fact, in the beginning, it didn't really hurt. You're being visited by a fly there.
Yeah.
He's persistent.
So there's some of those down here.
Yeah, no problem. So it was just surreal. I got lucky because, of course, there was a bed in the guest bedroom, and I was right beside the side of it. And I put my weight on my right foot and fell back into the bed. And one of the big glitches we had was that the operator didn't understand how did your husband break his leg? Well, he stood up out of a chair, but he has multiple myeloma. But the dispatcher didn't know what that meant. This is a bone disease, right?
Right.
So oddly, there's a fire station just around the corner, maybe 3 blocks away. And I guess they decided to send a ladder truck over to, see what was going on, because this didn't make sense. In fact, my wife put me on speakerphone and I was screaming, I have multiple myeloma. And still, it just didn't register. It's a bone cancer. And so, the fire.
So did the bone break purely because of the cancer, or was it because of the therapy you were taking?
The cancer.
Okay.
It's really.
Your bones brittle, huh?
Well, it's called demineralization. So the malignant plasma cells create a protein. And it's the protein that's toxic, not the cell itself. I mean, it's the cell that's making the protein, but it's the protein that screws up your kidneys and liver and your bones. So when you look at a PET scan, then and even later, my left femur was just riddled with cancer, and my entire right leg was nearly cancer-free, which how that happens, I don't know.
Interesting.
But again,
and is that typical?
Yeah, this is why we do PET scans, and this lets doctors see exactly where the cancer is collected, or actually, it's the cancer cells and where they are, and therefore where they are producing the toxic protein.
Okay.
And so I gotta say, this fireman, there were a few of them that showed up, and I think they were expecting to come upon an accident of some kind, and they were going to need to rescue me.
Yeah.
But what happened is my legs were hanging over the bed, and I got to tell you, I squealed like a little girl that just skinned her knee. I mean, it was the most intense pain. And trust me, I know a lot about pain because of multiple myeloma. And I've even had back surgery on my spine, which is quite painful. The intensity of that break was just off the charts. So hats off to this fireman. He got down on, the balls of his feet and his knees, kneeling, and put my foot on his thigh like I was getting fitted for a new pair of shoes. And I begged him not to move. Just please, 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 please do not move. It's just, the pain is just incredible. And of course, the firemen are like, yep, he broke his leg. We need an EMT. So EMTs came out and reaffirmed that I broke my leg, but now we needed a paramedic with a certificate to put me under. So we had 2 layers of verification that I somehow broke my leg. Well, they were never going to get my pants off, and they needed to get an air cast on this as fast as possible. And we waited for an ambulance. By the way, you can imagine the front of my house. Now there's a ladder truck and there's 2 ambulances, and, my neighbors know that I'd been battling cancer. And so now it's like, what the hell? And finally, a paramedic, which is above an EMT.
Right.
By the way, my daughter was a paramedic, so I know all of the hierarchy of emergency crews. And this guy shows up and gives me an IV and gives me Valium, which, I mean, I don't know how to put it. I suppose I was borderline hysterical. I mean, and I know the drill, right? When you have multiple myeloma for 5 years like I do, I jokingly consider myself an amateur doctor. And so the guy comes in and he's slowly explaining, I'm going to give you an IV, and I'm going to give you Valium, and then I'm going to give you some fentanyl, and then I'm going to have to put you under. So, and I'm like, been there, done that, hurry. I've had so many IVs, and in fact, oftentimes cancer patients like me have a port. And it just happened that at that time I did not have a port. I've had 6 different ports over time. And they're very convenient because you can access basically your heart. You can mainline. I jokingly say heroin addicts should have a port. That would be so convenient, right? But anyway, after he gave me the Valium, I was a bit loopy, and he goes, okay, I'm going to put you under, but just for a little while. And I said, reportedly, according to my wife, all right, I'll have a Michael Jackson hold the death for certificate. It just came to my head. I don't know. It was about being put under, the way that Michael Jackson's doctor was doing it, but please don't kill me. And although I was out.
You have a very sick sense of humor.
Well, it's gallows humor, I think.
Yes, right. Exactly.
Anyway,
your leg broke as that point in your therapy. What happened next?
Well, I was in the hospital. I have this card in my wallet that says, take me to the University of Washington Medical Center because this guy has myeloma and they have the charts, and you don't always treat somebody who's on myeloma the way you would a healthy person who fell out of a tree.
Right.
But they were saying, this has got to be looked at. This is emergency surgery. We have to go to Valley Medical Center down in Kent, which is not quite 6 to 1, half a dozen the other, but it was important enough for them to get me to a hospital sooner than later. And,
right.
It was a Sunday, but they just felt like 17 miles was too far and that 8 miles was better. So it was pretty bad. It was interesting. I was under apparently for something like 4 to 5 minutes, and it was like I blinked and I was in a gurney. And then after that, I remember nothing. But the following day, I'd had surgery. I was in the hospital. I was just waking up. My oncologist calls me and he says, hey, I've got some bad news. The trial we've been doing for the last 3 months isn't working. And he paused and then he said, are you okay? And I said, well, no, I'm in the hospital with a broken leg. And I guess that's what one might consider a bad day, right? So I was in the hospital yet again for, I believe it was 11 days. And then I got out and was on crutches. I was in like a walker type thing for a really short period of time. And then I got on crutches and, of course, was taking a lot of pain medication. Keeping in mind, too, I was fracturing or cracking other bones in that time frame. But one sad thing that happened was that I took enough pain medication to where I couldn't feel, as I was bouncing around on these crutches, that I was creating compression fractures on my spine. And I ended up in a PET scan learning that I had 6 compression fractures on top of the surgery that I had to remove my T3 vertebrae back in 2015. And so...
And that again, is a byproduct of the cancer.
Correct. It's like having a glass jaw, Right. So as I weaned off of pretty high doses of pain medication, my back started hurting quite a bit. And so now, we're in that sort of, May, June timeframe. And now keep in mind, too, that by June, which would be a year ago this month, today is the 30th of June, by the way, 2020, we were in trouble. And, we had kind of gone through everything and then some. And in about the middle of June, a year ago.
So you were at that point feeling you had exhausted your options as such. And your doctor was certainly suggesting that.
Well, and 2, I wasn't eligible for a trial. And right. The thing to understand about trials, as I understand it, is that these researchers write these trials and then they go out looking for money from pharmaceuticals and the National Institutes of Health, as an example. And you can't go ask for money, then get it, and then change your plan. So, right. In the write-up, they're saying, I'm looking for patients that look like this. Exactly. And there's a whole list of inclusions and exclusions. And so it's not easy to get in. And so now the anxiety is, well, when will CAR T be FDA approved? And my understanding is it is approved for leukemia, I believe, another blood cancer.
I think that's right.
But not myeloma. Mm-hmm. And so for the patients like me out there that are waiting, many are being told you're going to have to make it till FDA approval. And so that's living with that anxiety, which, I can empathize with, which is a big part of the reason why I wanted to do this is, people are just grasping at straws for answers about what is this, what is it like, and so on. So anyway, in June, I got a phone call from my oncologist, and he just called to say, listen, I'm in contact with 2 pharmaceuticals regarding compassionate use, but I'm going to need a little bit more time, maybe 10 days. And in the time frame since the end of March, when the other chemo stopped working, I began to study more intensely. I've always been a patient that has tried to learn as much as I can anyway, but now we're getting desperate. So I'm like studying these trials, and in a way that, doctors just don't have the chance to do, or even their PAs, their physician's assistants. They've got patients and they're trying. And keep in mind, your oncologist is going to nominate you for a trial. That doesn't, and he's basically looking at the criteria and kind of cursory overview, do you fit or not fit? And my oncologist was under the impression that I didn't fit. But anyway, on that same call, I said, before you hang up, I'd like to read a paragraph to you that's pretty complex, clearly written by an attorney. And I did. And I said, I think I'm an exception to an exclusion. And he said, okay, no problem. Hang on. Let me sit down and give me a minute. I want to read this for myself. And he came back and he goes, I am so sorry. I missed that. And you have to have some empathy for him. Come on, an exception to an exclusion. So you could go through the inclusions and you would say, nah, he's not going to make it. And then
these trial documents, they're pretty extensive. I mean, they're not a quick read, are they?
Well, there's 2. The one you might get from, say, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center is going to be kind of a, what do you call it, a synopsis. If you go to the National Institutes of Health and you read the entire, plan, yes, it's. And
is that where you found this information about the exception?
I actually found it in the document prepared by a rock star named Dr. Green at Fred Hutch. But again, I don't fault anybody, because this is the kind of thing that you could easily miss. I mean, again, you could imagine having hundreds of patients and then looking at dozens of trials and trying to. It's like you need an eHarmony for cancer patients, to find the right trial. And then you'd have to, as a patient, you'd have to have the wherewithal to know exactly how to key in. You have to know everything, calcium levels in your blood and, protein in your urine, and on and on and on. As an example,
it sounds like that's a real good testimony to the fact of advocating for yourself. And
correct.
A busy doctor may not have the bandwidth to read all the fine print, but since it's your health, it makes a lot of sense for you to invest that time. And it uncovered something, which is fantastic.
Well, you got to remember, it's not like I'm a hero. You're kind of in desperation mode at that point, right? And I'm getting sicker by the day.
Right.
And so, I had this fear too that, here's this world-renowned myeloma doctor, and I'm going to try to question him. Right. And I thought, gosh, how do I hope he's not offended. But then again, you've got nothing to lose at that point. Right. It's like, offended or not, I'm telling him.
I was going to say that's the worst thing that comes out of it.
Well, I had, my heart was pounding a little bit, not out of my chest, but I was a little nervous about bringing it up. But he was wonderful. He, by the way, is Dr. Libby. He was so gracious. He was so apologetic. And he said, listen, I'm going to call Dr. Cowan. I'm going to check on this right away. I'll get back to you. And maybe 10 minutes later, he sent me a message saying, you're going to get a call from someone to schedule an appointment to see Dr. Cowan, who works with Dr. Green. And again, I want to apologize and just say, hey, nice catch. And to me, that sounded funny. I kind of thought, nice catch. This is life or death. It's kind of like, sounds like some bartender pushed a beer off the end of the bar or something and somebody caught it. Yeah, so I was joking that, well, in that analogy, am I a premium beer or just a Bud Light? So, it's like, good catch.
So sure enough, this is in June, right?
This is in June. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens next?
Well, you begin screening, and we really got started on screening. There was a little bit of a delay, and this is what I find troubling about insurance, is that in this trial, they're going to take my body's T cells, which is a part of your immune system, and they're going to modify them. And then they're going to grow a whole bunch of them in the lab and then put them back in you. Well, it turned out my insurance company was saying, well, we'll cover, all of these ancillary costs that are not really covered by the trial. And there's a little bit gray because you're still treating the guy. Yeah. Right. And so there's overlap. And, well, is this because of this or is it because of that? And so you want to make sure that you check with your insurance company because there can be a boatload of costs that the trial's not going to pay for. And then again, it's confusing for everybody a bit because you're being treated, and there's tests in this screening process, which, by the way, is very rigorous. I felt like I was getting ready to become an astronaut or something. It's kind of a full-time job. But anyway, what they were saying is, well, we'll pay for everything except for right up to when they put your T cells back in, which, by the way, the danger for the patient doesn't begin until you put that. Yeah. So it's kind of, they want to make sure that my insurance would cover all of these other things. And then they'd have to disclose to me that, hey, you're going to have to pay out of pocket for this, that, or the other thing. Right. Well, it turned out ultimately they appealed, and the insurance company decided ultimately they would pay throughout the trial.
And by the way, Matt, as you and I have discussed, this whole adventure struggle with insurance companies is a whole topic unto itself.
Yeah.
And
yes, it is.
We may consider to get back together again in another podcast to talk about that subject. But I wanted to mention that because there's a lot of lessons learned in that process. Is that correct?
Well, I would say two things. I joked earlier that I'm an amateur doctor because I've done so many different procedures, but I'm also an expert on insurance because, and again, this isn't like a life dream come true. This is out of necessity. So yes, that's an entirely different topic we can save for another day.
Good.
So anyway, the thing about being screened is that you're not really in the trial. You need to understand this. You're not in the trial until the day they give you your cells back. You could come up to the day before that was scheduled, what they call day 0.
Right.
And you look good now, but this is kind of the weird thinking, I guess. It's hard to wrap your head around. It's kind of like, okay, you're dying, you're going to die, you're terminally ill. But if the screening says that the process would kill you, we're not going to kill you. So we're not going to let you in the trial because we think it would kill you, even though you're going to die.
So they can see by taking your T cells out and doing some work with them outside your body what the impact might be if they put them back, huh?
Well, actually, prepping for the therapy requires giving you an agent intravenously that kills off, it's biased, if you will, to killing T cells. So my T cells need to be killed off to a point so that there's room for the new ones. And in my trial, they were looking for people who were sick, very sick, but not too sick, and who they were going to give a large number of T cells back.
Yeah.
Versus other trials that were trying things like giving patients a little bit at a time, as an example.
Right.
So the baseline technology from trial to trial on CAR T has that base similarity, but then there's just trying to find the best way, what's the methodology for doing this the best way. And so,
I wonder, Matt, if it might make a sense to take a step back for a second and explain to the viewers what CAR T cell therapy is and what's the basic concept of what it's trying to do.
Well, maybe a little bit of background. I'm sorry?
I said Dr. Matt.
I didn't know this till recently, but humans have been trying for 120 years to find an agent that will kill cancer, but not the patients. And most recently, we've evolved to immunotherapy. And immunotherapy, in really generalized terms, is how do we help the immune system do its job? So it's a really different approach completely. Keep in mind, these agents that are used in chemotherapy, I would say, I call it biased. They're biased to killing cancer cells, partially based on the fact that cancer cells replicate very quickly and healthy cells are much slower. And so, the idea would be to find an agent that you could put in for a time frame, and then, you'd get an IV, and then you'd have a week off, and then that agent would go in and kill a whole bunch of cells because they're trying to replicate very, very quickly. And again, I want to reemphasize, I am not a doctor, and different chemotherapies work differently,
right.
But that's kind of its own heading. Immunotherapy is a different thing altogether. And so CAR T it falls in under immunotherapy.
Okay. And we're talking here about T cells. And T cells, as I understand it, are somewhat the soldiers of your immune system that go out and do the fighting of the disease for you. But often cancer cells put out proteins that sort of mask who they are, and they fool the T cells into saying there's nothing wrong here. Sort of Star Wars.
It's kind of funny because
so in this kind of a therapy, it sort of weaponizes the T cells so they see through these proteins and they understand that this is something to attack. And by putting these weaponized T cells back in your system, they attack very specifically the cancer cells. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that the actual mechanics of this are like trying to understand exactly how a central processing unit works in a computer. It's complicated. I kind of put it in layman's terms like this. My T cells see a cancer cell and they go, "Did you do something with your hair? You look different, but whatever. You're fine by me, kind of a deal. Whereas the modified T cell sees a cancer cell and goes, "Hey, you don't belong here."
Right.
And so, backing up just a little bit into that August timeframe of 2019, going in, then this was exhausting for both me and my wife. This is like a full-time job. You go in every day and you're getting poked and prodded and, x-rayed and MRIs and PET scans and on and on and on. By the end of September, we were exhausted. I was just beat. And so,
you've been getting the T cells at this point?
No. Day zero for me was October the 1st.
Okay. All right.
But one thing I wanted to point out was that as they got closer and closer to my condition and understanding my condition more clearly, it was decided, keeping in mind, my oncologist sits down and meets with the researchers and they have a roundtable about Matt Partlow. And it came out that, we have another trial that we think would be better for him. So we're not going to start on August 1st. You're going to have to wait until October 1st because they don't do these trials in parallel. They do one and then the other. And my understanding was there were 25 people in the trial that I was in. I was the 25th person. And the reason I mention this is because by September, I got to get through this without tearing up. I was in so much pain that you just can't imagine. I had broken 13 bones. And when I say broken, it doesn't mean shattered in half.
Right.
It means cracked. And then, we had done some chemotherapy. We did some kind of a cocktail of chemotherapies to just kind of go in and try to kill off as much as we could of the cancer. And then we did Velcade and steroids. Kind of, again, Velcade is just another chemotherapy that holds things in place. And I have started having just your regular pain, if you will, and then bone pain and nerve pain. And the problem we had was that we couldn't give me high enough doses of things like gabapentin, methadone, dilaudid, oxycodone, because the other things we were doing to prep for getting my modified T cells back were kind of beating on my organs, mainly my liver and my kidneys.
Interesting.
So it's kind of like, look, you're going to have to gut this out because we don't want to get you through the cancer and come out the other side and be on dialysis.
Right.
So, this is where I tip my hat to all of the caregivers because, I don't know. For me, seeing my children upset is more upsetting than being upset. And seeing my wife having to watch as I'm sick, which, by the way, getting sick with broken ribs and fractured spine and broken femur, this is very uncomfortable. And I also had what they called pain crises. It happened twice, 2 different times when I was at the SCCA, the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, and it happened at home probably another 8 times. And it's where you're in pain pretty much, but then out of nowhere, there doesn't seem to be anything that you would think is triggering this, where just from head to toe, you are in excruciating pain. And I just remember my wife helping me get back into bed. Like I got up and then had to go right back to bed. And I could sit on the edge of the bed, but then the trick of doing that 90 degrees and lying down flat.
Right.
Just sitting on the edge of the bed was excruciating. And then I had to sit there and rest. And much like when I broke my femur, I to be honest with you, I cried. It was just awful. And the part that's really hard is seeing my wife with just terror on her face, like seeing somebody in that much pain. In fact, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying it must have been really hard.
Yeah, one time up in immunotherapy, I'd had a pain crisis where I was sitting in a chair, and it was so bad that I kind of slithered out of the chair onto the floor, just trying to lie flat on something. And here you have like my wife and two nurses and a physician's assistant, and there's nothing they can do. They laid out this chair that kind of gets semi-flat and got me up into it. The only thing I could do was lie flat on my back. And I've kind of pampered myself at home. I have a really nice mattress. I'd say the brand name, but I need a royalty for that. And it's an adjustable bed. And I'm sitting in a chair that is very nice because I had to make those investments to support my back in a very special way.
Yeah.
So lying flat on my back, that pain would go away in about 20 minutes. And the thing is, you can't take opioids. They don't do anything. This is kind of like a phantom pain, if you will. And so, again, by the time day zero, as they call it, when I got my T cells back, August and September, I was just beat. And now remember, if you go back to 2018, and I had, quote unquote, 12 to 18 months to live, September was 18 months.
Oh, okay.
Now, I bought some time with the one chemo trial. It worked from April of 2018 until November of 2018. So that would throw off the estimate. But
right.
I knew I was dying. Yeah, you can just tell. I don't know how to put it in words, but and I don't know.
So you get to October, and then what's that experience like when they put T cells back into you?
Well, what happens is you check into the hospital because they really don't know how you're going to react. And so, to be honest, it's a bit anticlimactic. It's funny because my wife was there ready to record on her cell phone or her iPad, I should say, the event, if you will.
Right.
Well, there was a little bit of a mix-up when I checked in. The guy made a typo and had me in the wrong room. And so I checked in at about noon, and I was pretty hungry. And I tried to order food, and it's like, well, we got a billing problem. You're in the wrong room. There's a typo. We got to fix it. And so finally, after about an hour and a half, they go, okay, yeah, you can order some lunch now. And I did. And so amazingly coincidental, the guy shows up with lunch, and right behind him is a guy with a little portable cooler with my T cells on ice. So they showed up at the same time. Well, what do we do? And I'm like, well, I am starving. It's 2:00 in the afternoon. And they're like, well, that's fine by us. And I had an IV. You have to have a special IV because the gauge of the needle is larger than your typical IV for a blood draw or chemotherapy. Again, being a doctor, for a blood draw, you can use a 22 gauge needle. For an IV, it's got to be 20. This is an 18. So it's a big one. And they got that in, and I ate lunch while my new T cells were put in. which, and this is part of the reason I wanted to.
They did both at the same time.
Yeah, at the same time. And, this is funny because I wanted to share, because for us, we're sitting there, how humans who don't know what's going to happen have this imagination about, and you come up with all kinds of crazy things. I just want to point out that day zero is somewhat anticlimactic. And so, and again, this is where insurance and who's paying comes in. If everything's okay, they send you home within 24 hours, you are an outpatient. And so they want you to be an outpatient. And I did get sick to my stomach about 3 hours after lunch. I literally lost my lunch. And the following day, I woke up bright and early and was fine and went home. Now, one thing to understand is that when they put those T cells back in, remember, they're reprogrammed to go kill cancer cells.
Right.
Well, then if you were going to ask me how many cancer cells are there, I'd give you a rough estimate of somewhere between 1 billion and 1 trillion. I don't know, right? There's a lot. In fact, what happens at the SCCA is there's doctors from around the world who rotate in and out of there so that they can take their learnings back to, I had one doctor from Israel and another doctor from Switzerland.
Huh.
And 2 days before day zero, she walked in and said, and remember, I'm being screened right up to the 11th hour. And she says, listen, you are riddled with cancer from head to toe. However, we've decided we're going to go ahead and do the trial. And we'll do that on October the 1st. You'll check into the hospital. Here's a bunch of instructions. So just to be clear, I was very sick. And for people listening to this, they may have a totally different experience, because hopefully these kinds of revolutionary new treatments are going to be given to them when, like when I first arrived at the SCCA, I was in pretty good shape. I had no heart disease, lung disease, kidneys were fine. I was in very good health, except for that I had cancer.
Yeah,
and if
you're talking 2015 then?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, gotcha.
So my point is that in the future with these kinds of immunotherapies, rather than do, months and years of chemo, you, in my vision, would be as healthy as I was when I showed up, and then doing this kind of thing. And keep in mind, the prep for it is really toxic. But there's another problem. When those T cells are put in, they are laser focused on finding cancer cells and killing them. And so there's types of toxicity, or at least a type of toxicity, that can occur and can be very, very dangerous. In my mind's eye, I kept having this vision of portraits I'd seen of the Civil War, where there's dead bodies everywhere. And sooner or later, a wagon has to come along and pick them up. Well, the wagon in that analogy would be your liver. And so here you have millions, probably billions, I don't know, probably millions of T cells that are gone in, and they immediately start killing cancer cells. Like, as the IV, there's no marinating time, or they're dressed to kill, right? They're ready to go. And so,
and what did that feel like to you?
Well, I got nauseated, like I said. And here's the thing. After day zero, when I came home on day one, I was recovering from having multiple myeloma for 5 years. And I was recovering from the preparation for having my modified T cells put back in. And I was recovering from these T cells doing their job. So I was very sick all through October and November. I was sick to my stomach. I was treating with the standard treatments, for nausea and what have you. But even with that, it was pretty bad. I'm not sure you can sidestep that part. Even if you did a CAR T when you were relatively healthy,
right?
I'm not sure you can sidestep that illness. Although you might not have as many cancer cells as I did. You might be able to use, and again, I'm speculating, some kind of chemotherapy to knock that number down and then do CAR T without it being as significant as what they needed to do for me to keep my raging myeloma in check. And so I would expect that most people would be sick until they find other, the ancillary agents that they need to use to do CAR T. However, I would say this. What was amazing was in 5 days, that nerve pain I talked about was gone. And after 14 days, there was no measurable amount of cancer via blood draws and a bone marrow biopsy. On the PET scan, it looked like there was what they call uptake. And uptake is where there's a cell that has taken in the natural sugar and radioactive isotope called a tracer. And that uptake is kind of like a beacon for the camera, if you will, in a PET scan, CT scan device to pick up on. So they take a picture of your body with CT scan, and then they do PET scan and map that uptake to your body, and that'll locate the cancer. Inflammation can cause uptake. And so it was kind of like, well, there is uptake, but it could be from inflammation, from these bones healing and what have you. So it's kind of inconclusive. But the next PET scan that I did, I think it was in January of this year, that was clear as well. And so
literally in a matter of weeks, was materially consumed or killed or whatever it is.
Well, see, there's kind of a problem. It's like with the methodologies we have for measuring levels of cancer and where it's at are limited. So it's kind of like looking at the ocean on a boat. You can't see beneath the water, right? So it's kind of like everything's immeasurable. And theoretically, because the T cells took you from really sick to immeasurable, there's no reason to think that they stopped working just because we can't measure it anymore.
That's true. Yes. And so by January, how are you feeling?
Well, in December, keep in mind, by the way, I lost 35 pounds in 2019, and I'm still trying to gain that weight back. I weighed about 130 pounds on Christmas Day. And in January, I took my first walk around the block. It was hard. I had been pretty much sedentary when the snow came. So the snow kind of messed me up, and then I broke my leg. And so the sedentary lifestyle, keeping in mind my father was a PE teacher, this isn't something I'm accustomed to, coupled with you can't hold anything down. So you're not exercising, you're not eating. When you're our age, I know you're a little bit older than I am, you atrophy very quickly. Yeah. And so right now, one of my struggles is trying to gain weight, which I've never had a weight problem where I've tried to lose weight. I've tried to gain weight. people might be jealous of this, but I'm eating like crazy. Well, I can't. I'm having a hard time gaining weight. However, I didn't have a lot of body fat to begin with, so I lost muscle. Now, remember my bike that I worked on? I had it put back together before I broke my leg, and about 99%, it was rideable. I'll send you a picture. This is the coolest bikes ever. They're like literally a Cadillac.
Who makes it? Is it a brand?
No, it's a brand. It's made in Holland. This couple we know lived in Holland for a while, and they bought these bikes. Now they bought them in the early 80s, and now they are in their 80s. And I don't know, my wife had brought up that we were thinking about getting bikes because that's easier for me to do than walking, and certainly not running.
Right.
And so I didn't know what they were. The first time I saw them, I thought, oh my God, these are awesome. And it took me about 2 months I took the 3-speed hub apart in the middle and I painted them and I don't know. And again,
so this is January then, and you're starting to walk.
And
at that point too?
Well, one of the things they were worried about is a lot of these things they do can cause nerve damage, and myeloma can cause nerve damage as well. So the fear about riding a bike is, how's your equilibrium?
Right.
Well, I grew up on a Stingray doing wheelies, so I felt pretty good about it. But, even for me, I was like, gee, I got to be careful. Also, in early April, I visited a neurosurgeon about my back. I was referred to him by my oncologist, and the thinking was maybe we could use some bone cement. The problem was that I was too well healed. So basically what he was saying is, look, anybody can break a bone any day, and you most certainly can as well. But you have got to get your core strength back in your abdomen. You've got to help your back hold yourself upright. So you're going to have to get out there and work. And I can, you don't have to tell me a thing about it. I'm looking at your scans. I know it hurts. It's going to hurt. And he said an interesting thing. This kind of stunned me a little bit. He said, with regard to opiates, I know you hear on TV and the newspapers about the crisis. Let me tell you a quick little story. He said, my uncle just had quadruple bypass in, coincidentally, Switzerland, and they sent him home with ibuprofen. My point is that, and I'm the doctor here speaking, in America, doctors are prescribing opiates for everything. In your case, this is what opiates are for, in my opinion. So I don't want you to feel guilty about taking them. You're not going to get addicted to them. I'd never gotten addicted to any form of opiates because I was truly treating pain, serious pain.
Right.
So he said, listen, take the opiates, whatever it is, oxycodone, Dilaudid, take that before you exercise. We both know it's going to hurt. And so I did that, and I kind of got some confidence from him because it was sort of like I got the green light to kind of step up the exercise. Nothing crazy, but I mean, now you can pull on some elastic bands without your arm breaking off, that kind of thing. And riding the bike has been really wonderful. I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's like I told my daughter, when I'm out on the bike, it feels like I'm living. I'm not fighting cancer. I'm not a cancer patient. I'm doing something. Now,
great.
The irony is that we all sort of felt like maybe in March I'd have a sort of coming out where my immune system wasn't quite 100%, but you and I could sit down and have a drink as long as we didn't kiss each other or something like that. And then this COVID thing came along right then. So for those of you who are moody about quarantine, I've got news for you. I've been in quarantine for 2 years.
Right.
So I guess you can kind of get used to it. But right now, I feel better. I've been riding the bike almost every day, except for this past week. I had another bone marrow biopsy, which is pretty painful, by the way. It's where they take a core sample of your bone marrow in your pelvis. They semi-sedate you and give you fentanyl again and lidocaine, but it still hurts. So they give you medicine to make you forget the experience. So in real time, it hurts, but it's a little foggy afterwards. It's kind of like, I vaguely remember it hurting, but I barely remember it. So it's kind of like a tree falling in the forest. If nobody's there, did it make a noise? It's kind of like, well, if you can't remember it, did it happen?
Yeah. Well, needless to say, what the story you've just told is miraculous. I mean, it's amazing. And what have you come to understand? I mean, are you mid trial? Is the trial over? I mean, what's happening with this CAR T cell therapy?
Yeah, let me do two things. I didn't quite finish with the surgeon. He told me about opioids and what have you. And then he said to me, I'm not an oncologist. You have to go to a neurosurgeon when you're talking about the spine, right? So I've always admired brain surgeons, right? They're kind of the elite sort of doctors, which in my mind's eye made him an authority figure. And out of nowhere, he said, don't worry about the opioids. You'll be fine. If you need them, take them, and so on and so forth. And then he said, I went over your medical records, and I just got to say, thanks to some incredible medicine, we're having this conversation because you should be dead. And that he didn't soft pedal it the way Dr. Libby does. It was just one of those, I don't know, it kind of hit me. It's like, I knew all of this was true. I knew it before, but no one said it out loud. You know what I mean? He said the quiet part out loud. And so, that's just to give you an indication that that's how sick I was. Now, back to the trial. You do get passed back to your oncologist. However, you're still an experiment they want to study because, you've got to go in and at least do a blood draw to make sure that the cancer doesn't come back. And then there's other signs and that kind of thing that will tell you that it may be coming back. And then too, if it does come back, is it in some, evolved form, that expresses itself differently, that kind of thing. The other thing that we're testing right now with the latest bone marrow biopsy that I did, and blood draw and urinalysis, is did my body create antibodies that kills the T cells, which is something they worry about because my body may very well look at it as a foreign body. And then,
right,
what they're hoping is that these modified T cells will replicate in your body for some time. Now, you would think that if that did happen over an extended period of time, that like an Etch-a-Sketch, you're starting all over and you're 100% cancer-free. But you got to remember, they don't know how you got multiple myeloma in the first place. In fact, I had a very interesting conversation with Dr. Green, who is a brilliant man. And I loved it because, and you've had this experience, we, by the way, both worked in the computer industry. I worked at Intel, and there are some real wizards. I mean, it's a hierarchy of engineers, right? The top of Intel's a really smart engineer, and then it goes all the way down to the just pretty smart engineers. And some of them can speak to you without talking down to you, but without blowing you away. And that's what Dr. Green was to me. I asked him, I know we don't know what causes multiple myeloma, but I mean, you live this thing every day, right? You're trying to get to the bottom of it. What do you think? I mean, what's your guess? And he goes, well, I got it down to three things. We know that bacteria, as an example, played a role in our evolution, going back to the single cell organism, and that bacteria must have been beneficial at some point in time because here we are. And in fact, my understanding is you can find segments of your DNA, which is like 3 billion strands, that is exactly like a single cell bacteria. And maybe viruses played a role as well, and maybe cancer played a role as well. It's just a theory, but, cancer's just there. And then the other is that maybe something triggered it because there's a definite corollary between soldiers in Vietnam that handled Agent Orange and farmers today who have handled Roundup, which is they're both herbicides.
Right.
And a corollary just means that statistically there's a lot of farmers coming in with multiple myeloma. And of course, Roundup has been linked to leukemia, as I understand it. Possibly, I don't know how they proved that, but Monsanto is paying out. Bayer now owns Monsanto. They're paying out for claims in a class action suit for people who have, gosh, I hope I don't get this wrong, leukemia, I believe.
Yeah.
Or lymphoma, possibly. Sorry, but they both start with L. I'm too focused on the M cancers. And so there's that. And again, a corollary is just a corollary. That doesn't mean there's a, microscopic molecular connection between the two. It just seems fishy. And then lastly, he just said, throughout your lifetime, your body has replicated cells trillions of times, and it just could be a typo. It doesn't take much to make a healthy cell a malignant cell. You can just transpose 2 letters in a DNA strand and voila, you have cancer. And so even if CAR T, as an example, eradicated the cancer 100%, that doesn't guarantee it's going to come back. And then there's just that maybe people with similar DNA to yours are prone to have cancer.
Right.
We just don't know.
So that
another thing,
a genetic carrier.
Well, yeah, there's another thing too. We're living longer. And so if you went back to the Middle Ages where you were lucky to live to be 35, of course, you might have been a grandfather anyway. Back then, you didn't live long enough to develop some of the cancers. Keeping in mind with myeloma, I believe the average age for a myeloma patient is like 75 years old. So I'm a relatively young, I'm 63 now. That's a relative young myeloma patient. Not that it doesn't happen to children sometimes, but it's more common in older males. African Americans suffer from multiple myeloma more, per million than other people. And so, again, there's a lot to be learned. I don't think CAR T therapy is mastered for myeloma. I think there's a lot of work to be done with regard to how best to administer it.
Right.
One of the other glitches is that the pharmaceuticals value price medicine. I don't know if you read just yesterday, as an example, one of the pharmaceuticals has come out with a drug to treat COVID-19, and the CEO pointed out the cost and flat out stated that, well, think about it. If this gets you out of the hospital that much quicker, if you look at value pricing, this is a bargain, because some people in Congress were saying this is hostage taking. You want what, like some number, I think it was $4,000 per treatment. Well, it costs probably $1 to make. And so with CAR T, the numbers that I have heard are anywhere from $350,000 to $450,000. Now, if you're an insurance company, the problem is that, well, okay, it might have taken care of these people that have been in the trial, but how long is that going to last? It's not really worth $450K unless you can tell me it's going to last, it's going to be a cure.
Right.
This is an interesting thing about cure versus remission.
Right.
If you are in remission and get hit by a bus, you were cured. But if you're still alive, you're in remission. There's a difference. You follow me? It's kind of like a guy has a heart attack and the oncologist says, well, I cured him. The crazy people over there and the heart attack folks, they were the ones that let him go. He didn't die from cancer. He died of a heart attack. That's how they keep statistics. So
how do you think of yourself at this point? You think of yourself as cured, in remission? I mean, what's your viewpoint after all?
I think remission, keeping in mind, I did the stem cell transplant and it worked. But for me, my score indicated that this statistically should have lasted 5.5 years, but it lasted 6 months. And so now with this, it's interesting. I'd say right this minute, I'm more healthy today than I have been for quite some time. I have to think about it a little bit, because I've been in these ebbs and flows of being well and being very sick. Mm-hmm. But I would say they always ask me on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your pain level? I guess I'd put it that way. I feel like I'm like an 8 or a 9 with regard to how are you doing. I don't think my spine will ever be the same. I used to be a single-digit handicap golfer. In fact, I was a member at the golf club at Newcastle for a long time. It's a very difficult golf course. It makes you focus. And I don't think I'll ever be able to golf again. But remember, there's probably a lot of people out there who have multiple myeloma that are nowhere near as sick as I was. I got to emphasize this. I was in palliative care, which is a step before hospice care, which is a step before death with dignity. So I was joking around about, death with dignity. They give you the medicine to take home to really end your life. And it's pretty handy because you can either not do it ever or you can do it whenever you want to. I was kind of joking that I should get the medicine and have it on my nightstand in case Trump gets reelected. Then I can just, okay, that's it.
It would probably be worth a lot of black market.
Well, this comes back to the conversation about healthcare that we'll have to do at another time. And again, I hate to be political at all, but I firmly believe that as far as being in good health and being financially in a better position than most, and we can end with this, I guarantee you, no matter who you are, you're not prepared physically, emotionally, or financially to deal with a cancer like multiple myeloma.
Wow.
You're just not.
So the last question from me then, Matt, is what advice do you have for those who have listened all the way through this and are looking for, insight? What advice do you have for folks?
I think one thing that worked for me is just accepting the fact that these treatments that I've been through and that cancer patients are going through right now is tough. But there's no sense wasting life's energy moaning about it. I've always had a good attitude. It's interesting because after a while, people get to know you or know who you are at the University of Washington Medical Center and Fred Hutch and what have you. And I've gotten feedback that people look forward to seeing me because it's like, what are we doing today? What do you want me to do? Take my shirt off? Let's go. Let's get it done. Compared to, I feel sick and my back hurts. And I think attitude, if you go back and as an example, look at my Facebook, I've been I've joked about this all throughout. And I think that's important. And then to a point you made earlier, you have to advocate for yourself. You have to pay attention. Right. I get the feedback that, in fact, I just talked to a physician's assistant just the other day, and he said, well, you're kind of an unusual patient because you and your wife are so engaged in this process. I was talking to him about some scheduling problems that I was having. He says, you know what scares me about this? I mean, you're the kind of guy that picks up the phone and says something's wrong. I worry that this is happening to other people who just do what they're told. And right. One of the things I had to point out one time as just one example was I got this schedule where we need to do an ultrasound of a lesion. And then we were going to radiate it. And I had to call and say, don't you want the ultrasound and a biopsy before you start radiating? And you get this, oh, yeah. and it's a little scary. It hasn't happened often, but it's right. happened a few times. And so again, it's a positive attitude. It's humor. It's just accepting the fact that, look, yeah, this thing's going to hurt, or this thing's going to make you sick, or I don't know. We've joked a little bit about the SCCA being the cut, burn, and poison center, just because I've had a multitude of little skin biopsies and what you'd call precancerous chronic sun damaged skin that they really want to address, because when your immune system's suppressed, they don't want that to turn into melanoma, not to be confused with myeloma. That would be skin right. cancer. Right. And so again, I've been operated on. I've had ports put in and taken out. These are minor things. One of the things that I've pointed out to a number of people is that there's a lot of procedures I've done where if it was your everyday citizen, they would be telling their family, hey, I'm going to go in and I'm going to have this thing done and I'm going to be kind of laid up for a day or two, and it's kind of a big deal. For cancer patients, this is an everyday event. Right. You're getting a bone marrow biopsy or a PET scan. And think about this. They're putting radioactive isotopes in your bloodstream, letting it flow for an hour, and then you're sitting in a, cavernous scanner, which I think for many people would be very difficult. The other thing, too, is I have taken pounds of medicine, and I mean that, and gallons of IVs. And for a lot of people, taking things like methadone and Ativan and Compazine and Zofran and Marinol at the same time, I think for a lot of people would just be, oh my God, I'm just beside myself. I think I've handled that fairly well. it's just like the old adage, you have to remember you took something and that's why you feel this way instead of freaking out like, oh my God, I took this stuff and I just had a panic attack. And I could see that happening.
Sure. Sure. Well,
So,
listen, this has been so informative, and your story is just one in a million. I am just I'm grateful for the chance to just sit and listen and hear this all the way through. You and I have spent some time together, and I've heard parts of it, but not all the way through like this. Thank you so much for
thank you.
sharing this.
All right.
And to our viewers out there, if you have any questions for Matt or comments, this podcast will have a chat, or I should say a question facility that you can submit questions.
Comments.
And comments. And we encourage you to do that. If we get enough feedback, there are another 2 or 3 topics that Matt is anxious to dive into. And so let us know your thoughts. Give us some feedback, and we can carry on from here. I hope you've enjoyed the time, and thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.